This is a Power BI Quick Start. It's part 2. We're going to be talking about Power Query and DAX. So about me, you probably already know who I am, but I'm a business intelligence consultant, do a lot of work for Carlos with Power BI. I'm a Pluralsight author, and as of yesterday, I'm a Microsoft MVP. So this is all very new, all very exciting. So I'm going to talk about what's Power Query, what's DAX, why were both of these things created and designed, and a comparison of the two, because one of the problems that we run into is that it's not clear, where do I allocate the work? Where do I want to do the work? Because I have these two different tools, right? And they're not as specialized as you might expect, right? In the sense that, it's a lot less a hammer and a screwdriver, and it's always clear what you're dealing with, but a lot of times it's more maybe, a butter knife and a scalpel, and you can still cut stuff with both of them, right? And then if we have time, we'll have a super quick, really rudimentary kind of demo. So we'll see where we land with that. So let's go and get started. The first thing that I want to say is that in many ways, the combination of Power Query and DAX in Power BI is an accident. That is to say that they were designed and developed separately and somewhat organically, and then later combined. And what that means a lot of times is that you don't have as a cohesive as an integration or a clear-cut separation of the two as you might expect. So why did this happen? So first off, Power BI was originally born in Excel. We covered this last time, but just very briefly, it used to be a bunch of Excel add-ins. You had Power Query for data cleansing, Power Pivot for data modeling, Power View for data visualizations, and then Power Maps for maps. And these were separate. There was some integration. You could have the full data lifecycle, but they were very much separate products. And then later, these, at least the first two pieces, Power Query and Power Pivot, were pulled out of Excel. They made a HTML5 based rendering engine that wasn't dependent on Silverlight. And so now what you have today is kind of these 4 layers. You've got data preparation, data modeling, data visualization, and then report sharing and hosting. And so it's made of these pieces. So you've got the DAX engine, DAX language, or in Excel, it's called Power Pivot. And what we're going to focus on today is these first 2 layers. So let's talk about Power Query and let's talk about DAX. So what's Power Query? Well, Power Query, the simplest way to describe it is that it fits square pegs into round holes, right? In the sense that the data that we have available to us is often inadequate. Sometimes you're working out of Excel files. Sometimes your data might be optimized for a different use case. So one of the things I think about a lot of times is that for transactional databases, those are optimized for a minimal amount of writes, right? And then secondarily, read performance for individual transactions a lot of times, right? So the whole idea is, my spouse just changed their name, so they go by Miles now. And there's going to be a bunch of government databases that we're going to update as a result of that, right? And transactional databases are designed to make it so that you only have to change it in one table and it applies to everything, usually. But when we're doing reporting, that's not always ideal, because that might mean we have 15, 20 different tables that we have to connect all together in our reports. And Power Query is interesting because it's about 80% graphical user interface, right? The 80-20 rule applies. 80% of what you ever need to do with Power Query, you can do through clicking buttons and never writing a single line of code. And I think this is a really great approach for making it useful for business users, because there are cases where you do maybe have to look up some code or learn some code. And for people that are savvy with Excel formulas, there's a certain level of comfort there. But for a lot of the stuff that Power Query does, it's things that you might pay an intern minimum wage to do over summer in Excel, right? It's not intricate, complex work. It's, oh, well, we need to replace this value with this value, or we need to pivot this table, or we need to filter out blank rows, or all that kind of stuff. So why was Power Query designed? Well, in my mind, what it comes down to is that Excel is the most popular business intelligence tool to date. And data preparation is a big part of any type of reporting work or data science work. You'll hear that over and over and over again, that, data science is 80% data preparation, right? And a lot of the work that people do in terms of self-service or in the business is data preparation, data cleansing, and Excel. And Excel is terrible at this. It is just plain awful. And part of that is formulas are fragile, right? There's no syntax editor, there's no compiler to make sure you didn't type in something goofy. Like, it'll correct you if you type in something like you forget a parentheses, but in general it's kind of the Wild West. And you can lock cells, but a lot of times there's nothing to stop somebody from accidentally fat fingering the keyboard and deleting a formula or part of your formula. At my last job years and years ago, we had an old schedule board written in Excel, and it was kind of impressive in that, it would have a list and it would auto refresh, and then there was another page that would do a bunch of VLOOKUPs and HLOOKUPs and index calls and all this kind of stuff to figure out, okay, well, for this date and this technician, do they have a job? Is there somewhere they need to be? And then someone would delete a cell and it would stop working, and I'd have to fix it, and it wasn't documented, and I had to follow this Rube Goldberg chain of formulas to figure out how to fix it. What I really love about Power Query is it allows for a repeatable process. You define it, you hit refresh, and it just works for the most part. And so what does Power Query look like? So here's the Power Query editor in Power BI, but Power Query has been expanding to a number of places. It's in Excel. There's some support in Azure Data Factory. There's support in SQL Server Analysis Services for pulling in the data. But what we're looking at here is a bunch of different panes that all kind of tie together. So first you have the data. And what I really, really like about Power Query that I wish was more readily available in, say, SSIS, although I think you can do a little bit of this, is being able to see what the data looks like at each and every step of the way. So here we can see the data and not just the final result, but we can see, well, what does it look like at step number 3? Along the top, you have your transformations. These are all the different things that you can do. You can promote headers, you can pivot data, you can remove rows, you can remove columns, you can add and create custom columns, etc. And every time you click one of those buttons, another step gets added in this linear applied steps list. And this is good and bad because it encourages a very linear set of transformations. And so, it's just do X and then Y and then Z. And there are ways in the code to have branching and other types of logic, but generally it's a lot like a cake recipe or something like that, where it's do this, do this, do this, do this, do this. Now, this all applies for what they call a query. And over on the left, you have a bunch of queries. And each one represents pulling data from somewhere and making a bunch of transformations. And that's basically it. And they call everything queries, but it doesn't have to be a database. It can be pulling data from flat files, from cloud services, whatever. And then in the center there, real small, is the formula. And that's kind of the jump. Going from that 80% to that 20%, all of those steps that I made by clicking buttons produced M code that looks like this on the back end. And M code can be a bit intimidating because it looks like somebody took those alphabet magnets that your kids use and then got rid of all of the letters, and it's just punctuation, right? But what's important is that each of these lines of code corresponds to a single step. And in fact, if we were to rename that left-hand side where it says removed other columns or added custom, that would rename the step as it shows up in the user interface. So that's kind of at a high level what Power Query is. It's a set of simple linear transformations that you apply to your data to clean it up and get it into the shape that you want. And usually the goal of this is that it's this tidying that happens behind the scenes. It isn't something that's intended for the users to ever see or even be directly aware of, right? This is kind of the like midnight cleaning crew that comes in when nobody's looking and makes everything look nice and tidy. DAX, on the other hand, DAX is interesting because it combines column-based compression, and so you can get really good performance and handle a lot of rows of data, and Excel-style formulas for our data modeling. So why was DAX designed, right? And in my mind, again, I'm not Microsoft. I haven't talked to any of the developers. But in my mind, I think it's kind of clear why DAX was designed. And so the big thing is that analytical data is different. So what do I mean by that? If you ever worked with any kind of data warehouse, then you understand that the data has a different shape to it and it's used differently. So oftentimes we're dealing with larger volumes of data because we're looking at historical information, right? For operational reporting, for transactional systems, a lot of times we only care about the last year, maybe two. A lot of times for transactional systems, we're looking at a specific transaction. I care about a specific customer, a specific sale, what have you. And not only that, but a lot of times it's denormalized and decompressed. And so what I mean is that if in the transactional system, we had 20 different tables that were very minimalized, someone's username or someone's name, my spouse's name, for example, miles will only show up in there one time. And then that user ID, that ID number would show up in a bunch of different other places. Whereas in a data warehouse, that data might get carried down to the transactional level. And so you may have that name repeating multiple times. And so it's also in some ways decompressed. And what I mean by that is just that there's a lot of repeated values, right? So the data takes up more space than is perhaps necessary, but it's done in that way because it makes reads a lot easier. Finally, filtering is common because just because you have access to 10 years worth of data doesn't always mean that you want to look at all of the 10 years. You might want to look at a year-over-year analysis, a specific year. You might want to look at specific categorical information. How was sales in this region versus this region? Another reason the DAX was designed is that MDX, multidimensional expressions, the predecessor, was rigid and clunky. I thankfully missed the boat on that with my career, but from what I understand, it was powerful, but it was somewhat unintuitive. There was a learning curve, and the whole multidimensional part of SSAS really encouraged you to lean towards a cube-based approach where, okay, we have our star schema, we have our cubes, all this kind of stuff. And DAX is nice because it supports a much wider variety of data schemas, data layouts, however you want to think of it. And the DAX language itself is the syntax is intuitive. We'll say that. We'll talk about that more in a slide or two. And then finally, there's been a trend towards interactive reports. And so you want to be able to support KPIs and measures and things that respond to user input, respond to somebody clicking on a bar in a bar chart, clicking on a filter, all this kind of stuff. Now, DAX is kind of deceptive, and I talk about this a lot whenever I'm talking about the learning curve of DAX because it's misleading. So you start learning DAX and you think, oh, this is like Excel, right? I've got scalar functions, so I've got things where I'm concatenating two strings of text together, or I'm adding 2 + 4, or anything that returns a single value, right? And you think, oh, calculated columns. This is like adding a column in Excel and I've got a formula there. This is easy. And then things get difficult because we start talking about measures and filtering and the phrase evaluation context comes out. And the learning curve shoots up really high. And so you have to be aware of that that you're going to have to unlearn some things if you want to make the most of DAX. But let's talk a little bit about the columnar piece, about that and why it's so powerful. So imagine I have this information about T-shirts that I've sold across different regions, different stores in the tri-state area here. And I want to know, okay, what were my sales by color? Well, if I was dealing with a traditional row store engine like SQL Server, then what I would have to do is I'd have to read the data row by row by row. But what happens in the DAX engine in the back end is that they store it as columns. And so if I just care about sales by color, then I grab color and I grab quantity and I'm done, right? And so you can get really good performance that way because a lot of analytical reporting just cares about a few columns and basic aggregations and filtering. In addition, it opens up some types of compression and encoding. So real quick, there's three main types of compression or encoding when it comes to the DAX engine. So the first is value encoding. And that's when you have, say, I'll give you an example with QuickBooks. With QuickBooks, they're smart enough that when you start QuickBooks and you start a business, they don't start your first invoice number at 1, because that doesn't look very professional. Oh, here's invoice number 5. Yes, I totally have been working in the industry for a long time. They started at 1,000. And the next one's 1,002, 1,003, 1,004, all that kind of stuff. And if you're storing that in a database, well, if that number was, say, 1,000,000, you don't really need to take up all those bits and bytes storing numbers that big. What you can do is you can store that base value of 1,000 or 1,000,000 and then just record the difference or the delta, right? So if you have a range of integers that are all kind of narrowly clumped together, value encoding makes sense for that. Dictionary encoding is pretty simple as well. Here in Pennsylvania, we have the world's most famous groundhog, Punxsutawney Phil. And if I had a database full of groundhog facts, Punxsutawney Phil might show up a bunch of times, but that's a long name. What if I wanted to save space, instead of having Punxsutawney Phil every single time, I put the number 1 and then had a dictionary or hash object that allows me to look up, well, what does 1 refer to, right? And then finally, we have run length encoding, which depends on sorting of the data. So run length encoding, imagine I have my colors and I have the data sorted in this way. And I say, well, you know what? There's a lot of repeated values because we said that analytical data, it has a certain shape to it, which often involves a lot of repeated decompressed information. And we can recompress that. And it's even easier when it's stored as columns, because what I can do is I can say, you know what? I'm going to say, well, every time I change colors, I'm going to count what the run length was. And so blue happens once, green happens twice, and then red happens 4 times. So I store it as blue 1, green 2, red 4, right? And so the thing that I want you to get with a lot of this is that DAX is a way to encapsulate a lot of the business meaning and look at all of the data and aggregate it and filter it and interact with it in a way that's highly performant. So which do you want to use? So for Power Query, some things that you want to consider using it for is, first, data connections. Anytime that you need to pull out the data and access it, you're going to be starting with Power Query in terms of Power BI. Next is data shaping. So again, if you want to take 2 tables and join them and flatten them out, this is really good for that. If you've got values you need to replace, if you want to add buckets or bands to your data, you want to say, okay, well, how big of a customer are they? And we count the number of sales within a year or something like that to determine size. That all makes sense. But the big thing that Power Query makes the most sense for is what I like to think of as the dirty work of data cleansing. And specifically, what I'm thinking of is all the stuff that nobody needs to know about, right? nobody needs to know about the spill that you made on your carpet, right? You just clean it up and move on. Whereas maybe like how you arrange your furniture in your house or the floral pattern that you put on your dining room table or whatever, that's public. That's what you want people to see. But generally stuff that the user has no interest in whatsoever, Power Query makes a lot of sense for. Either of them can be used for pre-calculations, right? Because Power Query does all of its work and then loads the data into the data model or the DAX data model. And so Power Query can be really, really good for things that you need to calculate ahead of time. So you can imagine that maybe you don't have the line total stored in the database, but you have the quantity and the price. Maybe you want to generate your date table on the fly. And so you don't really need that to be responsive to users. You just need a table full of dates. Maybe you have missing values and you want to replace that with some other value, right? All these sorts of things. Maybe you want to remove duplicates, all that kind of stuff. And so both of these can do those pre-calculations, but I will say that I tend towards using Power Query for that because DAX is very, very limited in what it can do in that regard. They also both can do joins, but the meaning of those is different for Power Query and for DAX. Power Query is a lot closer to what you traditionally think about as a join when we're talking about SQL Server or something like that, or doing appends or unions. Basically, it's ideal for when you actually want to combine the data into a single result set. And this is common when you're dealing with sources from transactional databases and that sort of thing, where in the AdventureWorks sample database from Microsoft, you've got you've got sales header, you've got sales detail, and then for product, you've got product subcategory, and product categories, 3 separate tables. Nobody needs that, right? That's over normalized. And so Power Query is ideal for, okay, no, we just want one category table or one product table with all the information. Joins in DAX are much more about the relationship with the data, and they're there to facilitate the flow of filters from the more dimension or reference kind of tables, the coarser granularity, down to the transactions. So you can do joins in both, but Power Query joins are much closer to what you traditionally think of as SQL style joins. And DAX joins are much closer to relationships as you think of it. How does this table relate to this other table? And then we have DAX. And DAX is good for a couple things. It's great for user interactions. Power BI could not have the immense level of interactivity that it does if it weren't for DAX on the back end, because it allows these measures and KPIs to be recalculated in a very performant fashion. And so that second line there, dynamic aggregations, I can click on a bar chart, implicitly apply a filter for that category if I click on a sales for a specific salesperson, and everything else on the report updates, and that's because of the DAX engine. Finally, it's where you want to encapsulate your business meaning. And so what I mean by that is the dirty work of Power BI or Power Query happens often no matter what data you're dealing with or what company you're working for, right? We all need to replace erroneous values. We all need to promote headers from flat files. That first row we have to turn into a header. We all have to do certain types of work, regardless of the uniqueness of the business or the context. And so that's dirty work that is ideal for automation. It's cheap work in a sense, right? Or undervalued work, we'll put. DAX is where you say, what makes our business unique? Because what I found is you can have two businesses in the same industry and they have very different definitions for things when it comes down to it. So, I do work for Carlos, and we'll have a project, And the question that comes up sometimes is like, is this billable work or not? Right? We might do a demo for the customer and not charge them, and am I being utilized? Right? And it depends. It depends on the business how they count that sort of thing, and that meaning of what it means to say that an employee is fully utilized or partially utilized or what have you. That's going to be defined in DAX. All right, so I'm going to jump into like the simplest, whatever negative word you want to put here, demo, and then we've got 30 minutes for questions or just general purpose chat or whatever. So just want to give everyone a heads up on that. Okay, so let's open up Power BI. And if I was smart, I would have had a blank one open already because it does not like starting up whenever I'm sharing my screen. But this is the price of wisdom. It's earned through mistakes and regrets. Let's check the chat while that's going.
I was going to say, is this where we need to do the, dun, 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 dun,
yeah, right, exactly. Oh, man, okay. Yeah, so there was a comment, what are the alternatives to 38 character GUIDs for GUID keys? They do take up a lot of space, and they run counter to the whole idea of DAX compression because it assumes that there's repeated values. Basically, a lot of times what it's going to come down to is either doing your joins in Power Query and then getting rid of those GUIDs, or manually rekeying those through your data transformation process. And I've seen people do that on the SQL side or in Power Query, right? And we can talk more about that afterwards. So what I want to show you here. Go ahead.
Oh, are you ready?
I am ready to go.
Okay.
Yeah. So here's Power BI Desktop. It's completely free. They charge you for the subscription. The moment you want to share with someone in a way that's secure and non-public, then they charge you. But this is free. You can mess around with it. And a lot of this stuff with the Power Query and DAX, you can also do in Excel. So all I want to do is show you the real basics. Let's get some data. And what you can see is there's a lot of data sources. And there's even more if we go ahead and tell it, all right, give me more. It's thinking about it. There's too many data sources. One of the things that you'll see is that if you go to like if you go to other, there's all these like beta connectors and everything because everybody and their grandma decided to make one. But if we take a look, we can read a bunch of files. They had support for PDF, which is actually kind of amazing in my opinion because PDF's a nightmare of a format. Support for a lot of different databases, although you're going to need to install the drivers for most of them if it's not made by Microsoft. There's the Power Platform, bunch of Azure services, and so on. But in this case, I want to talk to plain old SQL. Now, what I can do is I can write my own SQL queries, or I can use the graphical user interface. Now, my recommendation is to use the graphical user interface because it allows for something called query folding, which we'll talk about. So here you could write your SQL, but instead I'm just going to say localhost, and I'm going to go through the GUI. And we're going to say AdventureWorks, and we're going to say order. And we'll say product. And I'm going to say transform data because AdventureWorks has just tons and tons of columns, and we don't need all that. So we want to do our transformations first. So what you'll see is the separate window opens up, and it looks similar to what we talked about. And so let's start with product. Well, I want product ID and I want product number, all this stuff. And what I also want is, let's say we get color, and then I want category information. And what's nice is it can read the relationships that exist in SQL if you've defined those. And we'll say I want subcategory. And I can remove other columns. And so it's just a right click, you make a change, and you can see over on the right it adds a step. And then I can expand this out and say, okay, I want the I want the name, and then I want the actual category. And again, I can expand it out. And this can get a little bit tedious, right? But I just want to show you how it works. And again, there's other ways to handle this, but it's nice that it has that built-in support. Do we have any categories? Okay, yeah, we do. And so for header, I can go ahead and keep sales order ID, order date, status, what have you. And then I want to show you how you can do some of these pre-calculations in Power Query. And you can do them in DAX, and you have to decide where it makes the most sense, right? So we're going to keep all of this information. And then in the source database, there's line total. And yeah, there's these GUIDs. We don't want them. We want to get rid of them if we can, because they do not compress very well. And you're right, developers do really like them. So I'm going to get rid of this line total. We'll pretend it doesn't exist, right? But then what I can do is I can say I want to add a column. And you could add from example, which I don't think that works very well for math, but it's great for text-based stuff where you just say, okay, let's say I have first name and last name. I can say, okay, create from these examples, and I type in the full name, type in the full name, type in the full name, and it kind of figures it out. But we're going to say we want to add a custom column. And we're going to say line total. And what I can do is I can say order quantity times unit price times 1 minus price discount. And I can say, okay, I want this to be a dollar value, fixed decimal number. So now what I can do is I can say close and apply. And so what it's going to do is it's going to run that logic on all the rows, because I haven't done any filtering, but I could. It's going to run that on all the rows in the data. And it's going to bring them in, and it's going to try to guess at what the relationships are based on the column names. And you can turn this off, but sometimes it's helpful, sometimes it isn't. Also, I promise it's way faster when you're not presenting. Let's see if there's any other questions. There we go. So we can now look at the DAX backend, and we can see that it figured out, okay, I've got this relationship based on sales order ID. And then I can go ahead and specify that I've got product ID and I've got a relationship there. And I could go ahead and bring in some visualizations, but we're going to say that for next time. But the one other thing that I want to show you is, okay, we've got we've got our line total. Well, I can go ahead and make the same logic. I can make a new column, and I'll call that line total B. And we'll say it's order quantity times unit price times 1 minus discount. And because I'm doing a column, this is pre-calculated. It's not a DAX measure. And so those values are stored and they take up space just like anything else. So we can use either of these to do that. And then finally, the last thing I want to show is what I could do is I could have, let's go ahead and have line total. And then I could also make a measure, and I could have a filter, right? And so I could say discounted sales. And so I can say calculate, if I can spell, sum of line total. And then I can specify some sort of filter condition to be able to have like precise logic or do comparisons. And so I can say discount is greater than 0. So I want to see what was the total sales for whenever the discount was something other than 0. So we'll go ahead and change this to be a dollar value. And I can drag that on there. Perfect. And so we can see that a very small portion of our sales, so 5 million compared to 100 million, was discounted. So most of our sales was total sales. So this is the simplest, most basic kind of demo. All right, so we got another 15 minutes for questions, even if they're, off the wall, that kind of stuff, or I'll be hanging around the chat. So does anyone have any questions?
Hey, Eugene.
Yeah.
It looks like Kevin's got a question. So Kevin, we're going to see if we can pull you up on stage here.
All right.
I think the repeatable question is a good one, right?
Oh, okay.
Right. So he's got all these different reports that may repeat.
I see that.
Let's see.
You're trying your best to summon him.
Yeah, I'm on. Here we go.
Hey,
All right.
there he is.
Great. So I manage, 1,000 different reports. I've got 200 data and lookup tables in SSAS and tabular model. I can't get to the tabular model to edit anything. Don't have a server, so everything's serverless. So how do I manage? Can I have one giant ERD?
Yeah, I remember your situation was a bit unique because you were kind of stuck on premises, right?
Not even that. We don't even have on premises.
No, but I mean, yeah. You're basically stuck in kind of Excel land and that sort of thing.
Serverless.
Yeah. Man, I think so. Yeah, I think your circumstance in particular is a little bit difficult, right? So if you had access to powerbi.com, then you can reuse these models fairly easily, and you can use data flows.
Okay, so yeah, I do have access to that.
Yeah, so something that we've done for customers is, let's say that we'll see if it works, but let's say I publish this somewhere, right? This amazing data model that I have. I have to save it.
You didn't show the ERD, but I assume there's an ERD.
So what I have here, this is the ERD essentially, right? The data model that's been made in DAX. So
we are not seeing your screen, Eugene.
Oh, sorry. Did I stop? My bad.
I think you presented me or something.
Got it. I'm getting it back. Okay. Thank you. So what I did is I just hit, I went ahead and hit publish, right? And I published to this workspace. And so one of the things that I can do is I can then, if I wanted to, I could create a new report, and I can say get data. And one of those options, the two options that are great for reuse in that space, is I could take that entire data model with all the logic, and I could go ahead and base a report off of that, right? So that's one thing. But let's say that you didn't want to tie together that same logic, because one of the things you'll notice is that I can see that ERD still, but I can't make any changes to the original, right? What I can do is I can add more measures if I wanted to, so I could add a new measure on top of it, but I'm limited to what I can modify. The other thing that I can do is I can create reusable Power Query called data flows. So let's see if.
So as he's doing that, right? But I think the idea is that you're basically taking a subset of data or a subset of that information or the structure and publishing that for people then to work with it. So they don't necessarily need either direct access, or you're afraid they're going to change it, muck it up.
Yeah. So let's see if I can actually successfully get into it. But for that code in Power Query, you can create something called a data flow. Let's just see real quick if I can do that on the spot. Data sets plus data flows, new. Do. And so here I can kind of go through the similar process, and I can even reuse that code. And so this kind of thing is really useful when you have very generic tables that you'd be using over and over again, right? So those are generally dimensions, things like date tables, all that kind of stuff, right? Where you're doing that cleanup work, but you're not applying the report specific or business specific business logic. And so then you can pull those in kind of piecemeal. Let's see if I can make an empty one, because I don't have, let's see if I can do one from a blank query real quick. Okay. List dot. Actually, here we'll just non-blank query. Let's see if that. Okay, and we'll turn that into a table. No delimiters. We'll rename that. And so this is all happening in powerbi.com. So you can imagine a date table that you just use logic to generate this. You can imagine pulling this from some sort of data source or what have you. Let's see. Should refresh. And then while that's happening, we can go back to here. And what we should be able to do. Is we should be able to say that I want to get data from a data flow. Let me try here. Get data, data flows.
So are you saying that I should never have an ERD that includes all 200 of my tables?
200's definitely pushing it a bit.
Because I don't have any reports that would use more than 6.
Yeah, I mean, so I wouldn't recommend it. We've done stuff where, and we've done as big as like 20, 30, that sort of thing. But there was a lot of overlapping use case.
Okay, so it doesn't have any way to smartly interpret a 200 table ERD.
No, it would be bringing in everything.
Which is exactly what my brain does every time I do a report. I have to interpret it.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Cool.
And
Thank you for the
David, we're
question.
going to see if we can get you up here. Okay, so let's see. So what David's question basically is in regards to, you know, MDX and basically the okay.
Yeah.
So it looks like we can't get him on here, but he's looking for, right? So MDX versus tabular, and then where are you hosting that, right?
Yeah, I see the questions there. So I think it's fair to say that MDX is it's a bit of a bleak analogy, but it's on life support, but it's not dead, right? Yeah. I think companies have made significant investments in that, but you know what I look at is I look at updates and marketing, right? And nowhere have I seen Microsoft making a big push for that. It's all DAX, it's all tabular. Compare that to SQL Server reporting services, right? Because that's a similar situation where we had an older technology that was a little bit stiff and rigid, and it seemed like it was dying and going away. And then they filed off the serial numbers and called it paginated reports, and they included it in Power BI Premium, right? Because it fit a specific use case that Power BI couldn't do, which is stuff that needs to print out pretty, you know?
Right. Right.
And it's just Power BI wasn't designed for and never will be. And so,
yeah, so I agree with that idea, right? So you
yeah,
talk about dead, right? So Latin is dead because nobody speaks it,
right.
right? But so people are still speaking DAX, but to your point, there's no investment there, right? Well, the companies
If
have made investments. There's still plenty of multidimensional models out there, but in terms of what's new, what they're
yeah,
building,
let's answer
tooling
it a different.
around,
Yeah, let's
right?
answer it a different way. If
Yeah.
I was a college graduate today, I wouldn't touch MDX with a 10-foot pole, right? If I was a senior BI developer with those skills, there's still plenty of places to apply that, right? That's kind of the thing. But if I was starting out fresh, I wouldn't be like, oh, I'm gonna learn this. And as for where to host it, what's interesting, I think there is some value in the scale out capabilities with Azure, 100%, right? Just because it's just so much easier to manage. But what's interesting is they keep saying Power BI Premium is going to be a superset of Azure Analysis Services. So it's not even just hosting it in Azure, it's hosting in Power BI Premium, right? So I think you're going to see that pattern more and more often. And they've been adding functionality for administering and managing Power BI Premium. So that's kind of the direction I see things in. But both are great questions. I appreciate it.
Right. Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of that is still in terms of so data warehousing, just in general, right? Is what infrastructure do you have in place, and where's your infrastructure going to be supported? I think we are starting to see companies that have, they're adopting more services, or they want to do things in data lake, right?
Right.
Some of the pure cloud services. Okay, well then it makes sense to keep that data, together, right? I'm building something new again, right? I'm not sure if, David, if your question is like, well, I already have this old stuff, right? Should I be building it, right? Or am I starting with something new? Because those are
I think the most charitable way to put it is MDX isn't dead, it's just done. You know what I mean? Like they're not making a lot of new investments, but it's still been around.
Sure. And then we have another question from Justin. Okay, so he asked about query folding, and I think he would like to go through that idea.
Oh yeah,
and I should say we actually have a video about this that we can point you to, Justin. But I'm sure if Eugene doesn't have his example right up live.
No, we're good. I'm still sharing, right?
I can see it.
So when you look at these steps, what you can do is you can say, okay, view native query. But here I actually can't, right? And so that means I broke query folding somewhere. And so if I go back, I can go to view native query. It's popped off the side of the screen, and I can see what SQL query it's running, right? Which means that the work is being pushed to SQL Server or the source, and is going to be oftentimes much more performant because SQL Server has indexes, it has caching, all this kind of stuff, assuming you have maybe a good DBA. And if you don't, talk to Carlos. And so what was the logic that we had here? Honestly, I'm not sure why this is breaking query folding, because it's pretty simple. It's pretty simple logic there. Oh no, there we go. So we can see it's running that that logic. I don't know why changing the type though would break that. So you really have to be good, maybe because it doesn't have a one-to-one match for currency. I bet you if I change this back to like just a raw decimal or something, it'll handle it just fine. So let's see. Let's do decimal number. Replace current step. Now we can see it, right? And it's basically inferring that that's the data type it would have. So it's not even having to do a conversion. We could change it to text, and we'll see it doing a whole in varchar kind of deal. Text. Replace current. So what you want to do is you're not going to be able to fold everything. And you can see like the SQL code gets really goofy, just the way it generates it. We've got like 3 nested queries. But the big thing is this. steps that fold successfully, and usually that's filtering, removing columns, all that kind of stuff, you want to have at the beginning of the steps, because the moment you have a step that it can't support in SQL or doesn't know how to support in SQL, everything after that's going to be broken in terms of query folding. So you have everything that can fold as early on in your list of steps, and then the stuff that can't at the end. And you can get really, really good. You can get really good performance. And so, yeah, this is why I suggest using the graphical user interface, because whenever I was adding code, if I said, okay, I want to talk to SQL Server, I could manually put in my code, but that means query folding is completely broken, because it doesn't know how to modify bespoke artisanal SQL. And so I really recommend, if you're starting out, go through the graphical user interface, and maybe a few more clicks, but you'll get better performance on average. And this is a really great feature for business users, because they may not know much about performance tuning or that kind of stuff. One other thing that's really cool is they've added built-in diagnostics. So I can start diagnostics. I can tell it that I want to refresh this table, or I could go back to the actual data model and refresh it, the full table. So I'm refreshing the preview, and I can tell it stop, and it creates a bunch of diagnostic queries. And I can go ahead and I can sort by the duration, see what took the most time, and then a lot of times it'll include the raw SQL somewhere. It is somewhere in there. Oh, data source query. So I can see, for example, that this general information query took a significant amount of time, all this kind of stuff. So there's some ways to dig into the analytics there, which is cool. Great question.
Okay, well, I think so, Justin. Hopefully that's helpful. So, like we mentioned, those are all the questions that I see. Thanks again for tuning in, and we hope to see you at the next one in 2 weeks.
Yep.